Buenos días y bienvenidos a esta...
Good morning and welcome to this fourth edition of the initiative that we organized jointly by Royal Institute, Elcano and Naturgy Foundation to look around the geopolitics elements of energy transition from different perspectives. And today we want to focus on the industrial and commercial policies and how they can impact the energy transition in important places like the US, China, and the EU, and how that will mean that the different areas will position in this energy transition process. And for this hybrid event, we have more than 800 people that are attending online. And here we have Charles Power, who is director of Royal Institute Elcano, and Maria Eugenia Coronado, who is general director of Naturgy Foundation, whom I'm going to give the floor. Thank you, Manuel. Good morning and welcome. Thank you very much for your attendance, both those who are here in person and those who are on the internet to follow this session in its fourth edition, and which is very relevant in the geostrategic realm. With such a large audience, I would like to take some minutes to tell you that our foundation devotes an important part of its activity to social aspects, headed by two programs which are very valuable to us. First, a vulnerability plan with which we try to reach the people who are in energy poverty, to help them through the energy rehabilitation and advisory elements to advise on the improvement of the household and generate some savings in their energy consumption, which is very important for them. Secondly, we have a program which focuses on generating knowledge in the energy sector from early ages, a program that promotes inclusion, technology, vocation, and which is promoting vocational training in green jobs to help young people get a job and to prevent them from leaving school and to help vulnerable people. The social work is complemented by another line of action which we consider very important, namely to generate spaces for reflection, for analysis, well-informed and deep-down analysis, always hand in hand with experts like the ones we will have here today to debate on the important topics that impact the energy industry now and in the future. This task we carry out through studies, analysis, reports, notes, conferences, and fora like this today that we celebrate thanks to an agreement which is very valuable to us, namely the cooperation with Royal Institute Elcano. Their experience, their knowledge, their strategic vision on many topics are a guarantee for us of the interest, the quality, and the content of these encounters. So it is very important for us to have had throughout all this time this cooperation. This activity and this forum of today with a strategic vision allows us to enlarge the focus and to look and analyze a very complicated geopolitical time with growing contentions in a very complex sector which is undergoing a transition process, technology transition with great challenges and goals to accomplish, which are of utmost importance. So the topic of this session couldn't be more appropriate. Industrial and commercial policies are redefining the global value chains and the balance between energy transition and industrial competitiveness in many regions in the world. So today we will be analyzing how three large economies like China, the EU, and US are responding in this context. And for this, we have the privilege of having very experienced participants, starting with Nicolas González Casares, who will present the Commission perspective as a member of the Industry, Research and Energy Commission of the European Parliament. Allows him to give us a very interesting perspective. I would like to thank him for his participation. I want to also thank the speakers who are here today. Thank you to Gonzalo, who will be moderating with his very deep knowledge on these topics. And finally, I would like to thank once again Real Instituto Elcano, represented by Charles Powell, for supporting us so that we can keep promoting this global knowledge and cross-cutting knowledge of the energy industry at large. Thank you, and I hope it will be very interesting for all of you. Well, thank you very much, Maria Eugenia. We have many years ahead of us to keep working on these topics, considering how geopolitics is changing year after year. I'm going to give the floor to Charles Powell, who's the director of Real Instituto Elcano, that is cooperating in this initiative with Naturgy Foundation. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Manuel. Thank you very much, Maria Eugenia. For Real Instituto Elcano, it is an honor and a pleasure to share once again this event with Naturgy Foundation, who's a member of patronate, and I want to convey the salute of our president, who's in Toledo, celebrating when Spain joined the European Union. Thank you for this event. I would like to share with you a couple of very quick reflections. The speakers who will be speaking later will elaborate a little bit more on these topics, and much better than what I can convey. But I believe it could be interesting to frame this conversation, which we will be having today, with some previous comments. Firstly, regarding the international order we're in, as you all know, there is a systemic rivalry that will probably prevail throughout this century between the US and China. But it is not a typical bipolar order. It is a multipolar order, probably with a more bipolar tendency, but it is undoubted that there are other emergent powers that we should keep in view, because those members of the UN, if we look to the votings at the General Assembly, they're not aligned clearly neither with China nor with the US. There's approximately 60% of members of the UN that may characterize as transactional, so they practice what we call strategic hedging. I have been in Kazakhstan for a week. I have been fascinated by this country. I had never been there before. And thanks to the energy power, I believe that Kazakhstan is becoming a clear example of a middle power and emerging economy, which is learning with great skills to navigate throughout these turbulent waters. It is in good relations with China, Russia, but also with the EU and the US. Therefore, we have a systemic rivalry, US-Chinese, but in a multipolar order and in a context of multilateral organizations which are in crisis, both the policies, the systems in the UN, and economic crises like the World Trade Organizations and the Bretton Woods organizations. And this is giving rise to a phenomenon that we're calling the mini-lateralism. For instance, in Kazakhstan itself, they head a group of Central Asian countries, and it's starting to be very important there. So I want to underline this is a very difficult environment for such a complicated organization like the EU, and it makes us wonder about our own identity, our goals. What is the EU, after all? We're basically an internal market of 400 million people, but a domestic market which is incomplete. And as some authors say, it is full of holes like a Gruyere cheese, because our policies are not as cohesioned as they were. We're far from being a political union. We're not an energy union, and this is very relevant for today's conversation. We know that we are incapable of guaranteeing our territorial integrity without reaching out to NATO. Even if we spend approximately 300 trillion euros in defense, we don't spend little, but we spend badly. What are we then? Many of us consider that we should consider the EU as a standard type of organization. But the problem is that many of these standards or rules are being put in question both by the US, but also by China and Russia. What is the EU response to these challenges? Firstly, what we have been calling the strategic autonomy, that I define in a very simple way. Strategic autonomy is our capacity to defend our values and interests without asking for permission nor help to third parties. This is the first bet of the EU right now. The second bet should be to complete the domestic market that, as I was telling you, has many problems, for instance, in the realm of energy, but also in the realm of productivity, even more than competitiveness, implementing the famous Draghi and Letta reports. And finally, something which is not said enough, we should work on our internal political and social cohesion versus the many populist movements that are becoming so important in many countries. So the EU is facing four important challenges, in my opinion. The first one is Russia. From the brutal, illegal, and absolutely unjustified invasion of Ukraine, Russia has become an existential threat for all of us, even though those of us who are in this corner of Europe who probably don't see it so clearly. It seems evident that Vladimir Putin does not want to reach peace in Ukraine, so the EU should stay firm in the policies that it has been carrying out up to date. Firstly, by the total energy decoupling from Russia, not only energy, but physical decoupling, like the Baltic countries did in February, disconnecting the grid from the Russian grid. And the other member states should follow the sanctions that, despite all the difficulties that we all are aware of, are starting to have an important impact. In other words, Ukraine's invasion by Russia makes us and gives us a very good pretext to try to get a better energy strategy and independency. So we have to keep having good traditional relationship with Norway, Nigeria, the Gulf countries, etc. But we should also look for other alternatives. The second large concern of the EU right now is the Trump administration. Who would have said, those of us who consider us Atlantists, that we would now be talking not about decoupling from the US, but de-risking, certainly, from the risks that the U.S. relationship convey. You will probably remember an American journalist many years ago said that some people, when looking to the Trump phenomenon, some take it not seriously, others seriously, but not literally. So now we have to take it literally and seriously. Trump is also a threat for the EU itself, so we must stay firm through a very robust tariff and commercial policy, and promoting the union against his attempt to promote a union and not allowing him to interfere in our affairs and carrying out a selective de-risking. And in this sense, we have to be very careful with the excessive dependency of the liquid natural gas coming from the US. The third risk is China. And I want to say that the EU is a little bit schizophrenic in its relationship with China. Some years ago, the Union defined policy versus China based on three axes: defining China like a partner, for instance, in the fight against climate change, a competitor in the commercial realm, and a systemic rival, because they consider that China is not following our rules. So this is a big problem, the fact that China is questioning the rules characterized in the Union. But we have to be very careful. The fact that the Trump administration has become a hostile power and unforeseeable, it doesn't mean that we have to fall in the arms of China. The EU should keep presenting a robust reaction against the tariff and commercial policy from China. We have to protect ourselves vis-à-vis phenomena like the attempt of flooding the European markets with batteries and EVs by China, and to try to diversify the value chains, or the supply chains rather, as much as possible. And I want to mention a fourth fourth challenge that the EU is facing, which is our relationship with the so-called plural South. That is how we refer to it in Elcano. We Europeans always feel that we are to be blamed with regards to the structures regulating the liberal international order. We're not alone. We're not the only ones that want a liberal order based on rules, foreseeable and predictable rules. This is something we could do, as I said in Kazakhstan before. Many smaller states, vulnerable but with emerging economies, are looking to Europe for the leadership. So I believe that the great contribution that the EU can provide to the very difficult international situation we're in is to try to lead the reform of the international order to make it more equitable and more inclusive. I hope these subjects will come up today, and I wish you a very fruitful event. Thank you very much. Thank you, Maria Eugenia, and thank you, Charles. We're living in a very complicated times, and we will certainly have a very interesting debate. For this session, we have Nicolás González Casares, who's a member of the European Parliament, a member of the ITRE, where the clean policies are part of the focus of the European Parliament. So thank you, Nicolás, for having accepted our invitation, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much for your presentations and your introduction, rather. I do not know what I'm going to do after these wonderful presentations, because it's going to be difficult to get to that level. Thanks, Naturgy Foundation. Thanks, Elcano Institute. Thanks, Charles. Thanks, Maria Eugenia, for this introduction. It sets a standard very high. Thank you also for organizing these very important events. And thank you to the attendants online and physically present. It seems that there's a lot. More and more energy discussions should be related to politics, because it's a dimension that has always been present. But I think that right now, which is a time of energy transition that we're living, we see especially we're living difficult times. We have the climate change crisis, and we shouldn't forget that beyond the geopolitical issues that we're having, the planet is warming up. And I'd like to remind you, a few days ago when President Mojica in Uruguay died, I remember I read a column that talked about a fable of a bird and a jaguar. It is a bird that has water in its beak to extinguish a fire in the wild, in the forest, and the jaguar sees the bird and says, "What are you going to do? You're not going to be able to extinguish that fire." So he said, the hummingbird said, "I'm doing what I have to do. I'm at least doing my part." And I think that that is what it happens when we in Europe are trying to do what we can. It's our part in trying to fight against climate change. We're criticized in Europe, I know, but we're doing our homework. We're fundamentally interested in trying to reduce our climate fingerprint. We're trying to work so that the planet is more friendly in the mid and long term to live in it in order to comply with our multilateral commitments, to fulfill them with the Paris Agreement, which is still a framework for the meeting, for multilaterality, in spite of the United States, and also because we are interested in doing it, because we are interested in the struggle, in progressing. It's good for us. We know perfectly well as Europeans that the consequences, the financial consequences of a dependence which is going to last forever on imported hydrocarbons is something that makes us be in danger. Russia, for instance, obviously we depend on the fossil fuels of origin because of many of the problems that we're living nowadays, including the security or the safety ones. But the solution obviously is not changing gas or fossil fuels and become dependent on others, replacing Russian gas by the gas from an administration such as the United States one that says that the EU was created in order to annoy the United States does not seem to be a guarantee of safety. So as geopolitical stresses increase, safety of energy and the resilience of supply chains, as we saw in the pandemic, have become core. And in that sense, there's a recent competition with China, which is bigger and bigger for clean technologies, and obviously because Chinese are very powerful and they can absorb and they want to try to look for critical materials which are necessary for the decarbonisation. This is remodeling the global economic landscape. And the only European way in order to increase competitiveness, in order to gain autonomy and reduce dependence, is reducing dependence on fossil fuels, clearly. We don't have them, although we do have other elements of energy that have a lot of potential. They are typical of ours that we need to make use of, which are renewable energies. In Spain especially, we're very well positioned in front of a historical opportunity, and we shouldn't ignore nor let the train pass. It is an opportunity that very rarely happens in history, and we're in Spain well positioned in order to benefit from that so that we can become leaders. We need to improve our competitiveness. We, Spain, need to be capable of attracting more industry. And in this climate context of crisis, before the Paris Agreement, we in Europe have been doing the energy transition with the European Green Pact, which is a strategic thing. In 2019, it was presented as a main legal, the backbone, which was the European Act, the Climate Act, and the Fit for 55 packages that help us comply with that EU Climate Act, reducing our emissions for 2013 at least 55%. After Ukraine war, we started the REPowerEU plan, how to reduce, how to act in front of this threat in terms of energy of the huge invasion of Russia in Ukraine. We need to strengthen our investments. We need to start a pathway that has no way back. The European Green Deal nowadays has been discussed by Trump, obviously, but it also has enemies inside. We need maybe to talk about the speed, the rate, but not the objectives. The targets are not something to discuss, because those who discuss the decarbonisation pathway of the EU are really not working for the European integration. In the parliament that was elected last year, we saw that there's a new European geometry with populist forces that are allied of the new American administration. And the fact that the European Green Deal fails represents opportunities for the policies that they represent. And the fact that we Europeans need to defend our values is important. We need to be aware of the threat that we're facing. Also, politics, internal politics is important, because in this complicated landscape, international landscape, we shouldn't forget that there's also enemies of the EU policies within our countries, within the Union. We need to remember that in 2022, EU was importing 5% of gas from Russia. Nowadays, it is less than 18, partly because of the acceleration of transition, more renewable energies, more energy efficiency, but also because of diversification. The Union is still working in order to reduce the dependence on Russia. Next week, the Commission will present legislative measures to eliminate the dependence that we still have, the gas that we're still buying before 2027. The legislation coming from REPowerEU. We need to be careful here. Obviously, we need to reduce. Obviously, we need to eliminate our imports from Russia. I totally support the phase-out of Russian gas, but measures need to be coordinated at a European level based on an assessment of the impact, so that we can ensure that not a single euro extra is going to go to Putin. That is fundamental when we take these decisions. In a geopolitical environment which is very volatile, the EU now has a value, and I agree with some of the words that Charles Power said, that we don't have a two energy union, we don't have a two single market, because there's too many internal barriers, and we don't even have a capital union, a banking union, and that would be fundamental in order to use it as a lever to warrant investments in technology for decarbonisation, because we need them. But we do have regulatory stability somehow if we compare ourselves to the other side of the Atlantic, and that is a competitive advantage, I think. Right now, it is key, this regulatory safety, because it is a strategic asset. Many of the solutions we want to implement have already been agreed. We just need to implement them. 1 year ago, approximately, even if this Parliament and the new EU Commission is more tilted towards the right than obviously the way I would like to, but we cannot go backwards. We cannot trust old-fashioned systems. The Union is now focused on the implementation of this legislative package, including a new design of the electricity market, designed with elements and tools to promote competitiveness and decoupling of prices of electricity, prices of fossil fuels, with tools such as contracts per difference, CBDs, and bilateral PPA agreements. And according to Draghi, the EU needs to speed up in this decarbonisation to find competitiveness. One of the elements that we're working on right now, we have the Clean Industrial Deal, which is the industrial pillar of the Green Deal in Europe that maybe had not been so clearly seen initially, and it was proposed by the Commission in February, and we're now finding a consensus amongst the main groups of the European Parliament to back that Clean Industrial Deal widely, so that all groups next week, the main groups of the Parliament, will vote in favor of it. A Clean Industrial Plan is combined with a plan of affordable energy, which with the objective of having more affordable of energy, with the financing of up to 100,000 million euros. It was presented a few months ago by the Vice President of the Commission, Teresa Rivera. And in order to increase the demand in products and clean technologies. The support to electrification, where we clearly are behind China right now. China right now has 30% electrification. Europe is approximately 23%. There's some inequalities between the different member states. Our decarbonization, we either are decarbonized or we're going to be decarbonized by others, and that requires electrification, although not everything can be electrified. So it is important to first focus on the electrification of what we can, how the household and transport industry, but also the industries that can be electrified. The solutions, but we are not supporting them, and the industrial Clean Deal needs to be focused on that. We need to promote flexibility, demand, storage, and we're massively promoting it. And this is going to increase the efficiency of the system. Electrification is key, but we hope that we find the neutrality of the climate between 60 and 65% in 2030. So there's a big part of economy that we need to decarbonize without electrification. Fuels are key. Renewable fuels such as, for instance, biomethane, biogas, or e-fuels. SAF and electricity-based fuels that are coming from electrons based on hydrogen normally. We need to protect our European industry with mechanisms of the global competition, which is cruel sometimes, of big industrial producers such as China, which by subsidies is able to reduce the price of products that they sell to us Europeans, but with a high load of carbon very often, so that CO2 is fleeing towards other places in the planet, so that the net contribution to a reduction of emissions is not complete sometimes. That is why we believe that the mechanism of adjustment borders, CBAM, can be a green sole element. We want to establish more tight relationships with those that also share with us our values. We're also seeing discussed proposals to simplify the European regulation. Sometimes I want to simplify. I do not want to deregulate. We've been regulating for 5 years, and I don't like to eliminate what was a big effort in order to increase competitiveness with simplification. Competitiveness. What is the challenge? Competitiveness cannot only mean doing things cheaper or with subsidies in order to have the fictitious competitiveness. The challenge is to do it in a fair, anti-regressive way. For that, we have the Social Fund of Climate, which is insufficient, I believe, or the contributions of the emission systems, that is to say, the amount of money we get from the pay for CO2. We need to use it as a lever, but we shouldn't forget that we cannot do anything from the public side without the support, collaboration, and trust of the private industry. The transition is changing safety problems by other safety problems, but with the change, we're improving, at least in some things. The think tank Ember says that when the fossil fuel stops, the economy stops. When the clean technology flows stop, only growth is at risk. Therefore, this is one of the challenges we're facing. We need to continue promoting and looking for levers for these green technologies that it seems that they want to abandon from the other side of the Atlantic, even if China is still supporting them. They need to be an element that help us advance in terms of competitiveness and industry. What's our advantage in this complex world of many issues where we are in an inferiority situation? The single state, the single state is our only value to face many of these challenges. And we need to demolish the barriers that we still have. We need to work on the capital union, but also we need to convince the European society, and this is very important, I think, that the pathway we're going through has no way back. we shouldn't stop. It's not good for us. We need to get the public acceptance of transition, and this has been very often forgotten in the development of renewable projects in Spain, but also other parts of the transition that sometimes confuse the citizens who don't know whether to support an electricity car or a heat pump to heat up their household because they see that the electricity prices are very unstable. We need to support them, give them confidence, but we need to know that those who need it most are those who have less. This transition should not only be fair, because we need to make it fair, but also because the people who are mostly affected by the climate change, but also potentially mostly affected by the polemic of transition, can be those that have less. The states and the EU need to have serious policies to implement fair transitions, not only in those territories that have been decarbonizing, which is where we started, but also in those social layers that are more needy. And here we have a lot to do in the European Union because many citizens perceive risks for their lifestyles, but also vis-a-vis the future of their children and their families and their activities, such as farming, cattle farming, maritime industry, fishing. I'm from Galicia, so I know about fishing. Let's make an effort. Let's try to convince with the transition in a good order, the renewables, the implementation and the zoning of renewable energies need to be made in such a way that our great sun, wind, and water that we have in Spain, we can fulfill it, but everybody needs to be on board. Finally, I'd like to remind you about something which is fundamental in our European societies when we talk about competitiveness. Maybe it's not included in the letter nor the Draghi report. A European lives as an average between 7 or 8 years more than a North American. 7 and 8 years more as an average. And when we ask ourselves whether we're talking about competitiveness, we always go to the economic field. But why is it that a European lives 7 or 8 years more than an American as an average? Well, mostly because they have the insurance warranted, because our air is more clean thanks to our policies of transition in our cities, because we take care of waters, because we have controls of food, probably more severe than others. So the EU is also helping us become more competitive in our lifestyles also. We shouldn't forget about that. When we want to talk about competitiveness and others suddenly talk about financial competitiveness, we need to insist on the fact that we, the European Union, have been able to achieve competitiveness in our life because we have life expectancy, which is better, health, which is better, and the European lifestyle is better. And we need to defend that. Sometimes it seems that it's at risk or very discussed often, but we just need to go out and make sure that we have freedom and safety, while in other places there's maybe safety but not freedom. And in some places there's freedom but there's no safety. And seeing what we're seeing these days in California, for instance, we are afraid of the fact that maybe in the place of freedom there's not so much freedom, and safety is also not so clear anymore. So we Europeans believe that we still have elements for competitiveness. And I'm over almost. Energy transition is also a geopolitical opportunity for Europe. Let's not forget about something that Charles Powers said earlier. There's people in the plural South that are similar in their lifestyles or values to the European Union, Latin America specifically. They have resources that instead of exploiting, we need to help them with making them more valuable. We need to generate more close or tight alliances. We need to help them in their transition. They need to help us in ours. We need to look for stable relationships. Mercosur is an opportunity, a historical opportunity, I think, for Europe also, singularly for Spain in this very restricted world that we Europeans have, that we're getting pushed from both sides. and the links that we in Spain have traditionally kept with Latin America need to be strengthened so that all of Europe and all of Latin America benefit from this symbiosis. And that's one of the main challenges that we need to tackle in the next few months in the EU and in the Commission. Even if there's resistance from some countries, especially France and maybe Poland also, in order to establish these agreements. I won't talk anymore about China nor the United States because there's a specialist on those two countries, but I'd just like to thank you again for your attention, and I hope that there's a fruitful debate afterwards. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nicolás. Interesting reflections on this framework, which is so complex. You were talking about the need to communicate and to explain many things to our citizens. Modestly speaking, this is what we're trying to do with Instituto Elcano and with Naturgy Foundation. We need to provoke and cause rigorous and serious debates on these issues precisely within the framework that we're facing, which is the energy transition, as you rightly said. Now we're going to go to the next part of the day. We have the participation of exceptional panelists, experts in the areas that we focus, the United States, China, and the EU. This debate is going to be, as always, as Maria Eugenia said, is going to be moderated by Gonzalo Escribano, who is the Director of the Program of Energy and Climate of the Royal Institute Elcano. We've agreed to reduce their CV as much as possible. Otherwise, it would take us too long because their CVs are very long, and we don't want to waste your time.
Introduced to Samantha Gross. Samantha, she is the Director of the Energy Security and Climate Initiative at Brookings Institution, and with, of course, a great knowledge about what's going on in the United States nowadays. Jai Yu, I hope I have pronounced your name. She's researcher at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and she will provide us with her knowledge about China and that area. And finally, Pedro Linares. Pedro, he's a professor in the Department of Industrial Organization of the Universidad Pontificia Comillas and Director of Economics for Energy. He will provide us with a vision of the industry as greatly affected by the issue that we are talking about, or we are dealing today with all of you. Thank you so much for all of you for accepting this invitation. Si me gustaría clarificar a todos los
I'd like to clarify to everyone here, and those of you who are connected online also, that you can ask questions via the platform, which has been prepared for that, and also the distributing cards here in the meeting room.
So much to the Naturgy Foundation, and thank you so much, Nicolás, because it was a very impressive presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I think you gave us a lot of food for thought. And I was beside Samantha, and at some point Samantha said, every time we talk about Trump, it's kind of difficult for our American friends to digest this situation, and especially the very grave events we are seeing these days in California. We are here not to talk about this. We are here to talk about, which role industrial and trade policies may have in this energy transition. How can it support European strategic autonomy, and which kind of tools and policies, accompanying policies, can we implement in order to ease this transition and do it in a fair way, just way, also to have, a good relation with, diversifying relation and establishing new alliances with other parts of Latin America is clear. The Elcano Royal Institute has always insisted on that. But there are also other areas in the Mediterranean, and for sure other, as my director Charles Powell said, other developed countries like in Canada, that they are very much in need of European law, I guess. So these are the kind of things that I would like you to ask, to help us, to get a clearer view of which policies and which measure can we adopt, because in my opinion, at the European Union we are now at a crossroads, and it's not that clear how are we going to implement such policies, and I'm glad that we are going to have new policies and new measures in the immediate future. But my point here is how can we approach this problem not only from Europe, and we got Pedro for this, as a full professor, he can teach us about this very, very clearly, but also what's the perspective from the United States and how to deal with China. So with this in mind, I would like to pose 3 sets of questions to all of you, and also to try to leave some spare time for and getting some of the feedback from the public or people that are online, because we will really like to do this in a very lively way. So my first question will be a very primary one. Which role may have industrial and trade policies in the emerging geopolitical rivalry that my director was mentioning between China, the US, and the European Union? Is the energy transition at risk because of the fragmentation of value chains and policies? How can we mitigate this fragmentation, or perhaps we should not? So this is a very open question, I know, but I got a more precise one for later. So if you agree, we can start with Samantha, and then we go to GIE, and then we go to the European enveloping of all these things. So Samantha, please.
Thanks. Thank you for the invitation to be here today. This is actually my first trip to Europe since Trump's inauguration, and certain things are a bit painful, but I'm taking it as best I can. I am very concerned about the degree of polarization and what it means for the energy transition. Reason being that, and this has been very evident in my country even before Trump came back to power, there's a couple of different ways you can approach the energy transition. If you want to do it quickly and at minimum cost, you're using a lot of Chinese products and Chinese materials. China has in many ways cornered or nearly cornered the market on certain materials, particularly certain critical minerals, and not just the mining of those, but the refining of those materials in particular. And so in a lot of places, the value chains are immature or sometimes just don't even exist for certain materials that are crucial to the energy transition. That's great for China. They made tremendous investments, and those investments are paying off. They had an industrial strategy that was looking to the future on this. But now we're all in this position of being somewhat beholden. You saw that in the US IRA that passed back in 2022. It was very focused on revitalizing American manufacturing, creating new value chains in the clean energy space. But the issue is that's going to take time and cost money. And so I'm concerned about this trade-off between cheap and immediate and Chinese versus wanting to have new value chains in the West, however you want to define that today. But that's going to take longer and perhaps cost more money. Just to close my comments on this question, if you look at a couple of the companies that do energy scenarios looking forward, and there are quite a few of them, several of those look at a very bifurcated or divided world. And the thing that they point out is that slows the energy transition. And I think that is the world that I see us headed towards, unfortunately.
Yeah. GIE, how do you see it regarding China? What can we do? What's your approach on that?
Sure. So thank you also very much for this invitation, and I'm really honored to be on stage with such distinguished fellow panelists and yourself. I think as it relates to industrial policy, one thing that I'm very sometimes keen to stress is the domestic political dimension of what industrial policy is about. Certainly it connects to geoeconomics, of course it connects to the green transition, but sort of the domestic political discussion around the state-society compact, around jobs, around loss of welfare. I think these are fundamental to some of the plans that have been developed, that are being implemented. And not all of these domestic political developments are necessarily in line with the green transition. And I think that's an important factor. And I think when we think about sort of onshoring and reshoring of supply chains to include the critical minerals supply chains, I would also stress the quality of jobs, the content of the onshoring. What kind of manufacturing are we bringing back? And the fact that China does dominate in these sectors, that it had an industrial policy around minerals, but other kind of downstream applications. This was part of its developmental trajectory. This is not something that the EU or the US has had to face for a very long time, the prospect it has to have developmental type measures. But again, were these quality jobs? Actually, these were offshored from the EU and the US because these were low quality jobs. We didn't want to be mining here. We didn't want to be polluting our communities, in whether the US or in Europe. So I think the question of not only the political discourse around bringing jobs back, but what kind of jobs are we bringing back? Do they actually contribute to the fundamentals of the broken state society compact, which is being renewed? But it has to be done in ways that are targeted, that are nuanced, that actually do provide growth, that do provide sustainability, that are environmentally productive, and also are not counterproductive to the green transition. So I think these are sort of fundamental questions that we're grappling with now that I think still don't have very clear answers. And I think the more that we can sort of sift through the discourse, get past the politics and take a hard look at the numbers and what is this going to cost us? What is this going to cost the green energy transition? How much is it going to slow the pace? How much is it going to raise the prices? I think that will be the question that I think that analysts will have to grapple with and should be grappling with at this very moment.
Pedro, we land in the European dimension. How do you see this?
I think that Samantha and Jai have raised really important topics, which I'm not going to duplicate. So maybe just to provide a more European perspective, or the way we see the transition is, first I don't see that the energy transition is threatened. It's probably about the rhythm, as Nico was saying before, right? But I do believe that we need an industrial policy, because the way we see the energy transition in Europe is we are already delivering in many aspects, but we're still not delivering, and again, Nicolas said that very clearly, on showing the benefits to society of the energy transition. Of course, there are many, but the way they perceive it is probably not enough to create this strong support for the transition. And there I think that competitiveness and good quality jobs, as you mentioned, are central, right? And this is where industrial policy has a very strong role to play. So if we forget about industrial policy and we only look at energy policy, then we're absolutely missing the points. And when we look at competitiveness, and this is the other point I would like to make, is we tend to think of low energy costs, right? Everybody's talking about, the Germans now are thinking about subsidizing their industry. And the question is, of course, this is very important for some energy intensive industries, but those aren't the ones that are generating the good quality jobs. So should we really focus on energy costs, or should we be focusing more on innovation, on automation, on the real elements that have made China competitive? I mean, China is not competitive just because of low wages. They are competitive because they have automated significantly the production chains, right? So I'm shifting a bit away from energy policy, but I think that discussion is central to all this idea of how well we can do in Europe compared to other regions, and how well can we manage to advance in the energy transition. And the other point I would like to make, which is we're all discussing how this new fragmented world is going to have an influence. If you look at this from the European perspective, maybe a fragmented world is good for us. Because it goes to, if we think about the full liberal multilateral world, that is a much more competitive world. And it is very difficult to create the space for Europe to develop this new industries or these new services that we can bring in. So maybe we could also look at this fragmented world as I know it's a pain for some countries, some regions, but it might be also a good opportunity for us to rethink. And of course, in that sense, and that's my last comment, the key element here, if you want to live and prosper in that fragmented world, you need to be united within Europe, and that's of course a big question that was raised before.
Yeah, very pertinent comments on the significance of innovation. Should we invest more in reducing costs and giving subsidies, or more on innovation? I understand that you tend to think that it's more important to invest more in innovation, and I will tend to agree with you. I will tend to agree with you on that. Okay, if you agree, I don't know if you want to add something to this discussion, or we go for an...
I would love to add a brief comment, and that is, I love your comments about the quality of jobs and the fact that many of these investments that China made were part of its development pathway. Because something, I hate to get too political, but it's unavoidable in this discussion, that is something that I have real challenges with in the Trump administration's policy, is that it seems to be focusing on reshoring jobs that I don't think necessarily Americans want, or that the American economy wants. And in some ways, I read a terrific article in The Atlantic, if anyone reads that here, a while back, about the fact that this policy is almost trying to run development backwards in many ways, and moving away from this innovative economy that we've always been towards a more manufacturing, and not that all manufacturing is sort of simple and easy, but towards more of the basic manufacturing, which is sort of exactly the opposite way that our economy, and Europe's as well, has been trending for all these years. So it really brought up some thoughts that I had read and thought myself in my head about what direction the US is going and what it means for us.
Interesting. I will go now to ask you, which are the prospects for the evolution of both industrial and trade policy related to, energy products and mobility and all that in each big player? I mean, in GIE, how do you see? For sure, everybody thinks, okay, this Chinese strategy of industrial innovation and industrial dominance, if you want, is going to stay here. But do you see any change or any nuance to be made to this prospect, or you just think that the Chinese strategy will be exactly the same? For instance, if they start to get more pain to get into European markets or to react to the very significant tariffs imposed by the US, what could be the Chinese reaction in industrial and trade policy? What will be your conjuncture?
I mean, since nearly more than a decade now, China has been very, very strategic in terms of the sectors it supports and the long-term vision for what sectors of the economy will be competitive in the future. And I think that that's not a question that was happening at the state level, less among EU member states, less among US politicians. And with election cycles and political priorities that have been on a shorter time frame, coupled with the lack of kind of industrial policy type tools in the West. So I do think China's long-term vision around strategic emerging sectors will continue as it has done. They've had in their plans, sort of progressive increases in terms of how much of the Chinese GDP should actually be in these sectors, and they've been meeting those targets quite well. And again, it's across. It's more than just production of goods. It's entire skill sets. It's sort of vertically integrated supply chains. But I think very importantly, it's the skills base. And I think that if we're going to talk about certain sectors that are very much part of the conversation around industrial policy in the US and the EU, just to bring it back again to critical raw materials, the US and the EU are not competitive in these fields not only because of mines, but it's the entire, again, skills base, everywhere from geological prospecting to processing technology, and the skills and the labor force necessary to make these also cost competitive, not only at home, but also abroad in resource-rich developing countries, where resource-rich developing countries, including in Central Asia, as was referenced today, they may claim and they may very much want European investment versus Chinese, but at what price point? With what companies? Are those companies ready? Are those companies familiar with operating in different kinds of markets the way the Chinese are? Can they offer competitive sort of contracts, and do they even have the skills and expertise actually in this regard? I think one thing that is kind of interesting related to the innovation discussion and also China's developmental trajectory is the strong role that FDI had played in China. In a sense, it was the transfer of European skills and technology to China, and now we're talking about Chinese innovation and Chinese technology, and it's a sort of an open question for me how the EU should approach the possibility of actually sometimes benefiting a little bit from Chinese FDI. But I understand that's also quite a sensitive conversation, and that's why sort of it's interesting to put things in different pots, because when we talk about green transition, it's one thing. When we talk about geoeconomics, it's another. There's another set of policy considerations. And then when we talk about security and security risks, that's yet another pot of concerns. And we've got to somehow balance all three of them at the same time.
I start to get very interesting questions, but I don't know, Pedro, if you want to add something on this.
I think she raised a great point, and we've been thinking about that recently. When you see, for example, for electric vehicles or batteries, Europe has absolutely lost the war. There is no way.
You mean in electric vehicles and batteries, you are combined?
I think we can't forget about it. I mean, it's very difficult to move ahead of China in that regard. So what Europe is doing to a large extent is to bring China in, right? And we have been thinking about exactly that same question, is when China required these foreign investments, they did that under a certain contractual agreement where they had to be shared property, and so that Chinese could learn. And now maybe we have to replicate that model back in Europe. And maybe when we bring battery factories and electric vehicle factories here, we should be doing the other way around. We should be learning from the Chinese and not just allowing all those companies to come in, but also to design it in ways in which we can also profit and learn everything that we have lost along the way, right? So it's quite interesting that we should be kind of assimilating some of the ideas that the Chinese used before.
Great, because you already answered the question of whether the European Union can still compete on solar. So I mean, that was already, I can't throw it away. This discussion is interesting because I think there is a division of opinions within Europe. I mean, some people think of the risking, they call it the risking by embracing. That's exactly let's try to do the same that China did with foreign investment. But other people, like for instance from Bruegel, Alicia Herrera and others, they are much more skeptical whether the European Union will be able to do that and whether China will allow us to cut this. And so there is still this discussion, you know. But okay. I'm afraid to ask you what are your prospects for industrial and trade policy from the Trump administration, but I have to do it. I mean,
well, to respond to what you said quickly, this idea of partnering with Chinese companies, I think, is a good one. I mean, China isn't just the world's factory anymore. It's also an engine of innovation in ways that it didn't used to be. But I feel like we in the United States, and before the Trump administration, we're doing a really poor job of that because we have this element of great power competition with China and this fear of Chinese hegemony, which we don't like to think about. And so we're viewing China differently than Europe is, and I think in many ways to our detriment. So, for instance, the US has been reluctant to partner with Chinese battery companies for our own electric vehicle industry. seems a little silly to me, because if you look at the US car manufacturers, they've taken big bets on electric vehicles, and bets that will last a lot longer than a US presidential administration. So, the administrations will swing, and these companies will do what they think is right for the future, or what they think their future market is. And so I actually think Europe is better positioned to do some of these cooperative things than the United States is, because we're all gummed up in this idea that we're in a great power competition with China. And perhaps we are, but that doesn't mean that we should compete on everything or separate ourselves in every way. The world doesn't work that way. Should I go into trade? And that's a whole nother can of worms, but we can open it if you like.
Yeah, why not?
So an interesting fact to me is that both Trump and Biden have been similar in that they have wanted to revitalize US manufacturing. What they've differed on is pretty much everything else. What manufacturing they'd like to encourage and the tools with which they'd like to use to do that. What the Biden administration did with the IRA looks more like industrial policy, picking industries that we expect to be the beacons of the future and investing in them, and investing in US innovation in those industries, and trying to find the niches in which the US can lead. That looks a bit like what China did years ago, although perhaps, a day late and a dollar short, as we say in the United States. But there's still areas where I think we have the potential to lead. The Trump administration wants to revitalize American manufacturing, but wants to use completely different tools to do so. They really see trade tariffs and exclusionism in America first, and even American dominance in some sectors, as the way. And so rather than encouraging the industries of the future, they're focused on excluding products from other countries. I don't see any way where we can tariff our way to an internationally competitive economy. Full stop. Even if that strategy works and we end up onshoring a lot of new manufacturing, which seems unlikely, the end state of that is fat, dumb, and happy protected American industries. This is not where we want to go. And so I'm deeply frustrated with our trade policy, not just because I think it won't work, because I see it alienating our trade partners, because I see the constant here and there and everywhere of it. I realize our president views that as a negotiation ploy, but it also makes it almost impossible to make investments in my country right now, because businesses don't understand their future costs. Even businesses he claims to support strongly, like fossil fuels. And so that's not the happiest of pictures, but I think it relates back to, we were doing industrial policy for a while, and now we're doing something with the same goals, but with completely different tactics and methods.
Okay. If you agree, we can now move to the EU responses and how do you see it from abroad and from within. I will start with GI. GI, I really recommend you to read a wonderful paper she wrote on the comparison between the risking strategies in the EU and Japan. And I think there's a lot to learn from Japan. And I don't know if you want to share with us, what could be a European Union response in the field of critical minerals. And with that, I also, there is a mortgage and another question. How do you see this, and also this debate about embracing or not, or, and there are also some defense, very, very important defense dimension. For instance, I was reading the other day, a Chinese company has restricted batteries delivery to a drone manufacturer in the US that is the main provider of Ukrainian military. So we are not just talking about, competitiveness and just transition, that for sure they are important, but also about, a much more strategic autonomy in defense that is increasingly important for the European Union in the current context. So what can we learn? What would be your advice for the European Union regarding this? Should we embrace? Should we de-risk? Should we decouple? Should we make a combination of them? And what lessons can be learned from the Japan experience that I find is very interesting?
Thank you for the question. I think it is actually a very interesting question because I think when you look at the sort of the geopolitical map or the risk game, I think Japan and the EU are quite similarly positioned as US allies that have been caught somewhat off guard in terms of what the rules-based economic and as well as political order means anymore and how they should navigate that. I think in terms of direct comparisons, of course, the baseline one that you cannot make with Japan is a single country. So in terms of the tools at its disposal, at the decisions that it can make and the speed at which they can make them, it's of course, I mean, we're not talking about a specific EU member state, we're talking about the supranational entity of the EU, and it's very hard to give direct comparisons and make direct recommendations based on the Japanese experience. I do think that what is very interesting about the Japanese experience is that they've been navigating tricky geoeconomic waters for far longer than the EU has, and far more savvily, and also with elements of not, let's call it the China model, but actually the East Asian model of industrial policy. So they were well equipped and they are very familiar with these tactics, which again are not unique to China actually, but actually quite unique to East Asian states, developmental states in particular. But as it relates to sort of the geoeconomic picture, I think the Japanese have been concerned as a resource poor, essentially island country with dependencies, vulnerabilities for a very long time, and not only in relation to China, which of course is its biggest kind of economic player, but actually from far before, with the oil crisis in the 1970s, Japan took a good look at the possibility of supply disruptions and made very strategic decisions that they were not going to, that they were going to cope, that they were going to institute measures to ensure that they were not going to be subject to geoeconomic winds. And I think the EU, having had sat kind of on top of the liberal economic order and having been the establisher of many of these rules, has not been in such a position of geoeconomic and geopolitical vulnerability before, the same way that Japan has. I think what is very instrumental and interesting about the Japanese experience, though, is also how they have been able to, despite being the subject of many of China's economic coercion measures and sort of trade winds that have of politicization, they've navigated a partnership still to this day with China, which is based on a concept of sort of de-risking, sort of de-risking in spirit before the term, sort of came into the policy discourse in 2023. So I think when we talk about Europe's open strategic autonomy, I think Japan has done it quite well. They do it in ways that are de-escalatory often. I think that's the opposite of what the United States does, which is it escalates trade tensions. It escalates, problems. It raises costs, whereas what the Japanese have done is, okay, what is the least de-escalatory thing you can do in terms of economic security? It's diversification. Who does diversification offend? Very few people. China has known that it has to diversify, and it has diversified its suppliers for decades. So this is not a tactic that somehow is counter to WTO, that offends a neighbor. I think there's that diversification of trade and trade partners. There's state facilitation, of course, of trade and export, and this is long-standing things that, of course, Europe is also only now starting to realize how to grapple with. But I think the Japanese case study is very good for Europe, actually, in spirit, if not in the technicalities.
Okay, in Europe we have to learn to navigate in troubled waters. It's a very clear message. If you don't mind, Pedro, I will go back to Samantha to get her view on the European dimension. And by the way, I'm going to recommend another paper by Samantha, a very good one on an American view of the European energy crisis. It's published in Brookings. I really recommend you to read it. I mean, what advice will you give to our fellow European officials on how to deal with this administration, and how can we? Is it possible to appease the current administration? Should we go with concessions, or should we go more assertive, as my director and also Nico to some extent suggested?
This is a difficult question. I feel like it requires me to take off my energy geek hat and put on my psychologist's hat. But in all seriousness, there are a couple of things that I think are true and useful to understand about the way the administration operates. The president likes to make a deal. He wants to be viewed as a deal maker. And so at some point, he wants to get to an end state that involves him having a win and making a deal. And so, yes, I wouldn't capitulate to us. Clearly, you need to keep your own interests in mind. But if you can find a way to keep your own interests in mind while giving him a deal, or the appearances of a deal,
Okay.
that is an incredibly useful thing to do. And also understand that he tends to come forward with absolute maximalist policies. And you've probably all heard the taco expression that got very popular a couple of weeks ago. And it means Trump always chickens out. But the idea was that Trump necessarily, I think he was offended by it, and I kind of understand why. Because it wasn't that he was chickening out, is that he always intended to back away from that maximalist policy. That wasn't the plan all along. And so I think he was feeling a bit misunderstood. But if you look at this maximalist thing, you have to think about that as a way as him showing up with an American baseball bat to start the negotiations, and understand that he doesn't necessarily intend to decapitate you with that bat. What he ultimately wants is a deal. And so that's kind of a balance between not capitulating, but understanding that if you can find some common ground that looks like a deal to him, that is a place where you might be able to find some space for agreement. And again, that's a psychological question rather than an energy markets question. But I think it is, and I also think that he appreciates strength and abhors weakness. And so capitulating is not your friend necessarily.
Okay. Well, Pedro, let me also recommend his blog post and his post that is very, very, very interesting. And he got a wonderful, and also his podcast. I mean, he got a very interesting post on the clean industrial deal. Now that nobody from the Commission nor from the European Parliament is present and you can speak freely, what's your view? I mean, I think we tend to share some idea, no? But I let you. What's your position on this, on the clean industrial deal? What can we expect, and what do you miss?
Yeah, I think the clean industrial deal is something that we absolutely need, right? We said before that we need to bring industrial policy, as we like saying, a smart industrial policy into the picture, right? So the clean industrial deal is clearly necessary. Now, getting a deal on this type of things among 27 very different states, you mentioned the case of Japan versus the EU, right? That's, I mean, I do empathize with the European legislators and commissioners, because it's so difficult, right? So in the end, I think that the clean industrial deal is probably a good idea, but it's going to fall quite short. Let me try to explain it. I think it has great ideas, right? For example, green public procurement is one of the elements that we have been arguing for many years, right? Yeah. Because in that regard, I would also like to introduce another idea, which is that industrial policy is not always about industry. It's about Europe being the second largest market in the world. we have to leverage on that, right? So, for example, if we set standards for green public procurement or for any other procurement, or if we set the right performances in terms of carbon emissions or efficiency or whatever, I think we have a clear way to go, right? So I think the clean industrial deal is well headed. Now, which are my concerns? My concerns are, where is the money going to come from, right? And that is a big question, because it seems like, okay, we are going to put a lot of money here, but we're basically taking it away from other places because we are not able to generate more funding, right? So for me, essentially, the problem with the clean industrial deal is, where is the money going to come from? And the second open question about the clean industrial deal is, if one of the largest challenges that we have is creating this innovation that we haven't been able to provide in the last decades, just saying that we're going to be using the same instruments is probably not going to change a lot of things. So probably we need to rethink the way in which we produce innovation in Europe. And we have been working with the Horizon program for many years. We are lucky enough to participate in many Horizon projects. But it seems that we are not able to provide this disruptive innovation that we need. We are not able to generate these new ideas that we need, or we are not focusing on the right topics. So for me, it's not only a question of scale, but it's also a question of how do we redesign our innovation infrastructure. And the Clean Industrial Deal mentions some ideas, but I think it doesn't go all the way. I think it's a good first step, but we shouldn't expect the Clean Industrial Deal to create this transformation that we need. Maybe we shouldn't just rely on it. Maybe we also need to develop other instruments.
Sure.
This is something that the United States has historically been very good at, and we have a good technical innovation ecosystem, but I think the thing that really sets us apart, and God willing will maintain it, is the way our capital markets work with our innovators. The depth and richness of US capital markets is really helpful in getting new innovations off the ground. Everything from angel investors and venture capital, all the way up the value chain through private equity, and up to perhaps an IPO for a new technology. Soup to nuts, you can go from a good idea to a factory in the United States, and we have the whole ecosystem to make that happen. And so as Europe thinks about how to do this, it's not just the government side, it's also how can you deepen certain parts of your capital markets to allow innovators the ability to go all the way from idea to bench scale to commercial. That's something that we do very well.
May I also add something related? I mean, one of the elements, one of the institutional arrangements that we always mention is, for example, your agencies like RPI or something that are able to take risks, right? That is something missing in European policy or in national policies within Europe. We don't think of public institutions as able to make bets and be able to and possibly lose some of them. That's fine. And also your point about here in Europe we are trying to create this innovation framework from the public side. I don't see that happening. I think you need more to create that on the public side. And let me also say one aspect from the Clean Industrial Deal, which is not exactly in the Clean Industrial Deal, but is very much related, which is the state aid guidelines. This is also one of my concerns about the Clean Industrial Deal framework, which is we already see the tensions between different member states, richer member states versus poorer member states. It's going to be difficult to push this unified framework for industry when different countries have different pockets and different interests. And I think that's also something we need to look at.
I would like to ask you, our director was saying he just came from Kazakhstan. He was very, very happy to be. It's a wonderful place, I have to say. They got very significant resources, not only oil and gas, but also in critical minerals. GIE has also worked a lot on Russia and the Soviet space, and we were talking before We in the EU, we want to decouple from Russia, but we are still importing a significant amount of critical minerals or minerals in general. I think only the UK has imposed some aluminium, but you will correct me on that, sanctions on this. What is the state of the imports of or dependence of the European Union regarding Russia, and which are the possibilities to diversify in the so-called post-Soviet space? I always thought about, okay, diversifying Russian gas in the Russian backyard was not necessarily a very clever strategic idea, you know, because at the end of the day you are very close to them. The European Union doesn't get that impact on those countries compared with Russia. So how do you see this? Because we talk a lot about the dependence of Russian gas and oil and everything, but very little people speak about dependence in other dimensions, like nuclear fuels, for instance, but also minerals. So what can you tell us regarding the European Union on this?
Yeah, I don't have the exact figures in terms of dependence. I know that for the first 2 years of the war, it wasn't a sector anybody wanted to look at in detail because, there are some things you want to keep a willful blind eye towards. And the minerals, a couple of the mineral categories fell into those camps. I think more measures have been introduced, I think, in the past year or year and a half. I think not only the UK, but I think there's been a stronger look at it. There's been some strange knockoff effects of that, one of which is that China now has cheaper access to ore because they're not being, when they're not supplied to the Europeans. It's made it cheaper and raised costs here, which of course is a general thing that happens with sanctions, including in the oil and gas markets as well. But in terms of the post-Soviet space more generally, I think this is very interesting because it touches on some of the other fundamental part of industrial policy and these new trade measures, which is partnerships, right? And the EU's side of the discussion in terms of how to partner with countries. I don't know that they're doing it very well, but if we look just at the post-Soviet space, one of the poster children for sort of a more diversified landscape for EU critical minerals was Ukraine. Yeah. This was 2021. You signed a critical minerals partnership with Ukraine with the idea that Ukraine also has many of the necessary ingredients for high tech and for green transition on its own territory. What has the EU been undercut by? It's not Chinese investors. It's not, Russian machinations, which of course that's also there. It's actually the United States. And so the United States has, in a sense, carved out a market for itself. I'm not saying that these were viable minerals, of course, and I'm not saying that the EU would have been able to access them quickly, but in terms of the geoeconomic picture of partnerships in general, I think that's the world in which the EU has to now operate in terms of how to do politics. We have resource mercantilism back on the table, and it's not China doing it. I think that's really, really remarkable. As it relates to Central Asia, as I mentioned, is one of those areas where they've done a lot of this strategic hedging for a very long time. They're very good at it. I would suggest not looking only at Japan, but also at Central Asia, because Central Asia has been operating in a multipolar world in its region for decades. And they know how to do it well. And one of the areas in terms of economics is they've been very keen to partner with EU and European countries across their economic space. They much prefer European companies. They much prefer American ones to Chinese ones. But then who ends up being on the ground? And I have to stress again, it's not only that the Chinese are cost competitive or willing to come into sort of more fragile markets or, it's also that the Chinese have the advanced tech. Europe and the United States have lost in the mining sector across the board. So, you can come in with standards. You can come up with great paperwork around environmental assessments and do those feasibility assessments in great ways. But when you don't actually have any sort of capability to put, this is going to be an American term, boots on the ground, I don't think it amounts to very much. So I think that there needs to be a wholesale assessment of whether or not these partnership agreements will amount to something. I think that we shouldn't publish, have these memorandums and then sort of never follow up on them and say, we did our job. Now we have great mineral partnerships all across the world now. I think there's a real harder discussion to be had. And I think it would be great, I think, for Central Asia, for Europe, for global markets, if those markets could be tapped, could be explored, could be diversifying the global pool of minerals that we need for the green transition. This is good for everyone. And again, I don't think it's escalatory in any kind of way. So this is good for everyone, but right now, in terms of the tools to make this happen, I see Europe as kind of as missing some of them.
I don't know if you want to add something, but if not, I will go to the remaining questions, and I will read it quite fast, and then you choose which one you like the most. One of them is, I have to translate now in my mind. You have been talking about the relation between China and the European Union. What should be the European Union position? Should we be more cooperative or more assertive? I think to some extent it has already been answered, but if you want to add something on this, I don't want nobody think that I don't read the questions. By the way, if anybody that is at place or online and want to send us any question, I will be happy to read it. Another question is CATL, a Chinese battery manufacturer, is setting a new factory near Zaragoza in Spain. News is 2,000 Chinese workers will be brought to run the factory. I don't know whether this is right or not, but that's the question. I'm just reading. So meeting you with Chinese tech and Chinese labor, it seems to the people who ask this doesn't think this is a real game changer. I don't know if you got any reflection on that. Another question or reflection perhaps, the EU now plans to negotiate the next multilateral framework. The financial, I suppose, what means the multilateral financial framework, with a Commission proposal coming in July 16. What key elements and which strategic investment priorities should the new European Competitiveness Fund bring to support funding to the clean industrial deal? To some extent it has been also been addressed, but if you want to add something on this. What are the perspectives to create a European market of green hydrogen? We have not speak about hydrogen yet, so that was a very, very good point. In a framework that is, let's say, signed by a geopolitical and geoeconomical framework less and less cooperative. So hydrogen, green hydrogen in a less cooperative framework across Europe. It is really possible to get a common position in Europe, how to manage it. This is a very broad question. I don't know if we got the time enough, but still. And finally, that's the final question I got. Can you discuss the prospects, strengths and weaknesses of clean trade and industrial partnership? That is something that has already been mentioned too, and especially with South Africa. I think this is a very specific question, so perhaps this is my suggestion to Naturgy Foundation. Perhaps next time we have to talk about Africa in general, because I mean, when we go to the things, I mean, let's a mineral partnership, not only with Ukraine. Hey, the US got one now, a recent one, with Democratic Republic of Congo, replicating the Chinese investment for infrastructure partnership. So I think that perhaps a good thing would be to think in the future, and this is a suggestion for the foundation, perhaps Africa will be important to get them in the picture, and South Africa for sure. So if you don't mind, the guy or lady who asked for this, next year we will get a more significant answer. A lot of questions, 9 minutes, 3 each. You can choose the question you prefer, or you can, while answering at least one of them, add whatever you think is important for our audience to get in mind. And perhaps with this, again, now we start with Pedro. Pedro.
So I think some of the questions were related to many of the topics we've been discussing, but maybe talk about this factory in Zaragoza or wherever, right? One of the things we start to see in Europe is, and it has to do again with whether we want to reindustrialize or what type of manufacturing we want to bring in. One of the problems people are talking about is that we may not have the qualified workforce that we require in order to run these high-tech factories, right? So maybe one of the things we should be talking about also is how to do this reskilling of workers if we actually want to do that, right? But related to that, the question then is are these the type of jobs in which we want to invest? Are these the type of manufacturing sectors we want to invest? Or maybe we would be looking at other sectors that are not already dominated by China. So, for example, Europe is really strong in engineering services. We are really good in chemical industries. So we do have some areas in which we are still, I don't know how long, but we're still good. Why don't we invest in that, right? Rather than bringing in industries or investing in industries in which we may not have this competitive edge, right? So this is an open question, but I think it's a relevant question when we're talking about it. And the other question that I guess you're expecting me to address is the green hydrogen thing. And the only thing I would like to say here is that we do work a lot on hydrogen. We have a chair in hydrogen where we're every couple of months updating our estimations. And every time we update our estimates, they go down. Every time we find that hydrogen is going to have less and less and less weights in the energy transition. So, of course, the question is, should we really bet that much into hydrogen, knowing that maybe many of these projects will be abandoned? And we're already seeing that. We're already seeing that many projects don't have off-takers. Because people tend to look at the options, and you find out that in more cases that we might expect, direct electrification is more effective. So, yeah, hydrogen, I remember 10 years ago we did a study in which we had like a big chunk of the economy which we call it X, and we said that might be hydrogen or biofuels or whatever. What we find is that chunk is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So betting very strongly on hydrogen, I don't know how robust is that going to be.
Thank you. Gia, anything you would like to answer or to address?
I could just make some general comments. I think a couple years ago, I think when the Green Industrial Deal and the Green Deal it was brought out, there was so much optimism that you could have everything. Just everything, everywhere, all at once, all the time. Everything's beautiful. Yes, exactly. That you could have transition, you could have growth, you could have security, you could have environmental protection, and just beautiful package. And I think at least today we are having a much more nuanced conversation about trade-offs, and I think that's super healthy because you cannot have blanket measures. You need very targeted tools in targeted industries with specific things that are suitable for circumstances as they evolve. And I think that this is what good policy making is not talking about big, beautiful things, which are visionary and necessary, but really the devil being in the detail. I found the Draghi report to be very nuanced. I think it was clear on some of the issues around trading-offs for efficiency and possible kind of slower decarbonization as a result of relying on China less. I would, as somebody who actually works at a security think tank, not at Environment or Energy One, I just have to make a plug for CIPRI here, and the fact that most of my colleagues they work on security and defense matters. And one issue that as I was reading the Draghi report, which I read it a lot later than I should have, one area where I didn't think that the trade-offs were discussed enough was the trade-off between green transition and decarbonisation and industrial plan and security and defense spending. As you've mentioned, where is the money coming from? And sort of, I remember I noted down in reading it, said digitalize and decarbonize and increase EU's defense capacity. And I'm like, oh wow, that's a lot. That's a lot. Can we do that together? Do these come in line? You can have discussions about greening your military, but I don't know if that works on the battlefield as effectively in the timeframes that you need to. I mean, so I think that this is a question in terms of the trade-offs that I still have. I haven't seen the studies in terms of, you know, how that's going to be handled, but I think it's going to be a very important one in the coming short, medium, long term, maybe even.
Yeah, very important. We are also an international relations think tank, and so for us, defense is very important. Yeah, some people say, okay, there are some opportunities in you know, for instance, you mentioned e-fuels and all that. You know, 60% of the fuel consumption in the military are planes. It's true that this is not a big chunk of the market when you compare with commercial airlines, but still, if all European countries will pull together and try to promote, you know, some procurement on this kind of clean fuels, perhaps it could help to some extent. The same for batteries that are increasingly used in military equipment. You know, now you got drones. Electronics are getting more and more important in defense, and all kind of systems depend a lot on electricity, and there are some opportunities there in order to try to advance European industry in that related to defense. But for sure, greening the military. I mean, many people says that heavy industry will be the last to decarbonize. No. Military industry and defense will be the last sector to decarbonize, because it's not only that they spend a lot, it's also that to build military equipment is very intensive in energy, because there are very, very specific materials that need a lot of energy. So, yeah, I mean, this is a very, very relevant point that we in the international relations and defense space like to highlight. We close with you, Samantha. Any question that you like to address? Any other, you know, point that you would like to raise?
I think I'd like to tie some of the points we've just heard from the other speakers together around hydrogen. And I'm not at all surprised to hear that your hydrogen forecast keeps declining and declining. And I think the way I'd like to describe that is we can break the laws of man all we want. There are consequences, but you can do it. God's laws, nature's laws, the laws of thermodynamics, they're with us. They're not going anywhere, and they cannot be broken. And with technologies like hydrogen, or I did a seminar yesterday here in Madrid on carbon capture and storage, these technologies cost a lot of energy. And forever and always, they cost a lot of energy. And so we're always looking for the Swiss Army knife of decarbonization technologies that fixes everything, you know, in a reasonable way. And that doesn't really exist. Diversification is the way, looking at the specific process that you're dealing with and how to do that the best. And in many cases, that solution actually isn't hydrogen. You talk about jet fuel, for instance. Jet fuel may be one area where e-fuels make sense, but you have to remember with e-fuels, you're for all intents and purposes running combustion backwards to turn CO2 and hydrogen back into a fuel. And so you only want to do that when you really, really need it. And when you think in terms specifically of green hydrogen, it requires a lot of renewable energy. So you're going to need to produce that in an area where renewable energy is plentiful and cheap. And Spain may be one of those areas. But thinking about an overall European strategy for green hydrogen, it's going to be very regional, because if you don't have the specifics, you take something that's already expensive and energy intensive and make it even more so. So these technologies aren't just specific to specific processes, but they're also regionally specific depending on what resources you have.
Okay.
No one size fits all.
Yeah, that's a beautiful thing. Okay, we have finished with this panel. Before giving the floor for the closure, I would like you to ask to you all to thank first the interpreters that have done, I'm sure, a great job. Thank you so much for your job and devotion to this event. Every year we got the same interpreters and they do a fantastic job. But also to our panelists, all of you, very, very enlightening and very thought-provoking interventions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Really interesting ideas, and we have some ideas for the next year. No? I have two: Africa and perhaps the Central Asia, as you mentioned. Muchas gracias a todos. Muchas gracias a todos.
Thank you all. Thank you to everyone who's been here physically and present, and also to everyone who is connected online. We in Naturgy Foundation and in Real Institute Elcano, we will continue to promote a serious and rigorous debate on anything related to energy transition, and we hope that you find it interesting. Let's see you soon. Thank you.